And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Hello, everybody. For those of you who are new, first-time listeners, welcome to the Eschaton podcast. For those who have been around for a while, welcome back. It's been 2.5 months since the last episode, the longest gap between true episodes since I started this podcast back in 2017. So first and foremost, I apologize for the absence, but those of you who have been listening for some time, or even just the last few episodes, understand that it's been kind of a tumultuous time. I won't rehash all that here. I know that last episode kind of went off the rails into a personal, reflective, existential kind of direction that we don't typically go in this podcast, but I just wanted to be transparent and honest with you guys. I won't talk about it now, but just to give you a little bit of a snapshot as to what this episode's going to look like. I'm kind of going to break it into 3 parts. First, I'm going to give you kind of a mini episode on something that I've been researching and planning to talk about for a while now. But, for those of you who aren't familiar with what had been going on, I had to step away for a while, just kind of work on myself, work through some personal things. Number 1, I'm going to talk about that content, which is about the Greek philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras. So it'll be kind of a mini episode. That'll be first. Then number 2, I'm going to give a little bit of an update. The second part of the show will be kind of an update on where we are in terms of the year that is 2020, the COVID crisis. Cases are picking back up again here in the West. I just want to talk about that because if you recall, we did a couple episodes back at the late spring, beginning of summer, talking about how to prep, how to prepare for what may or may not be coming. And now we're just a few days away from the election in the U.S. By the time this comes out, we will be either at or right before the election. And I just want to talk about that because I think there's some interesting and concerning things that just want to remind you of, and then also just make sure you're prepared for, and make sure I'm prepared for. Don't get complacent. I know the last few months things have been a little bit calm in the macro sense, but I think that's about to change again as we go into the winter months. So we'll talk about that in the second part of the show. And then finally, the third and last part, for those of you who are interested, I'll give a little bit of an update on what's been going on in my life, what I've been doing in the absence of 2.5 months and where things stand. But I'll save that for last. I don't want to bore everybody or distract anybody with that. So unless you want to hear it, that'll be tagged on to the end of the episode, and you feel free to tune out before we get to that part if you don't want to get caught up on my personal goings on. But in any case, let's jump into it. It's been a couple of months, and I know this episode will probably be a little clunky. I've been out of the saddle for a long time, so I have to get back into the swing of things. Hope you'll be patient with me. Like I said, this will be kind of a short mini primer episode on Pythagoras and some interesting highlights of his life and some of the teachings that he had. And then I'm going to jump into those other 2 topics right after that. So let's jump right into it, guys. So when I say Pythagoras, most people immediately probably jump to a high school math class, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And rightly so. Pythagoras was a mathematician. He was, by all accounts, a great mathematical mind at the time he lived, about 570 to 490 BC, in that time frame. So he comes before Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, all the Socratic philosophers. So he's pre-Socratic is the term they use. And essentially what that means is that it's a different time in terms of thought and understanding and just influence. Pythagoras came from the Greek island of Samos off the coast of Turkey, but it's thought that he was actually educated and studied in Egypt, which, remember that, because when we come around to some of his individual teachings here in a minute, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. I think it's interesting and likely that he was, in fact, educated in Egypt, and you see that come through in his teachings. He founded a school in Italy, in the city of Croton in Italy, and basically it centered around what most of the ancient Greek philosopher schools started, focusing on the Platonic school or the Aristotelian school, philosophy, math, specifically geometry, music, astronomy, as well as other humanities. But those were the big four buckets. And I would say math, music being the big two, but the others, are kind of at the foundation of his belief system. Like Jesus, Pythagoras didn't write anything himself, so everything we know about him comes from his followers and people who wrote accounts of him. So, like a lot of living legends, he never put pen to paper as far as we know anyway. And what we do know about him has been passed on from his followers, so some of it may not be authentic. You get second and third hand accounts. It's really hard to separate the wheat from the chaff sometimes. But what we do know is that he had several core teachings. And some of those core teachings, to this day, kind of define Western thought. And not only Western thought, but I would say esoteric thought as well. Some accused him of being a cult leader. He had a very strict religious code, almost like the Levitical code in the Old Testament, about washing your hands and animal rights and all sorts of things like that, which I won't name here, but a quick Google search can give you a list of the weird things that Pythagoras taught in terms of just structure and order to life. And for that reason, people said that his school was actually a cult. And it may have been, to be honest with you. From what I've gathered about it, most of his followers did kind of look to him as a religious leader or a spiritual leader, not an organized religion by any means, but they did have a legalistic set of values and customs that they followed. But his teachings, the ones that I find interesting, apart from his achievements in the world of math that we all know about, are a little bit more, maybe esoteric's the word, but they're a little bit more otherworldly for sure. Like he was big on numerology, which we'll just talk on that one briefly. But I think it's worth noting that to Pythagoras, everything consisted of numbers. And this wasn't new. He wasn't the first one to really call this out. And in the modern kind of new age kind of world we live in, numerology has become sort of commonplace. But at the time of Pythagoras, that wasn't the case. And number and mathematical patterns and sequences, like the Fibonacci sequence, those things hadn't come into the normal repertoire of thought yet. So Pythagoras was kind of a forerunner in regards to numerology. He saw numbers in everything, whether it be music, nature, even the cosmos and the stars. He saw numbers and structure, and he believed that numbers in regards to music equated to sound and rhythm. So to take that one step farther, he had this teaching called the music of the spheres, where he actually believed that each of the planets had its own unique sound based on vibration and frequency, according to its position in the cosmos, its size, and the numerical pattern associated with that. So Pythagoras, it would come to be proven correct, hundreds and hundreds of years later, but there actually are sounds unique to each of the planets in our solar system, and that's probably true for all of the cosmos. Pythagoras knew that before it could be demonstrably proved. His one core teaching, and this is the one that I want to really drill in on here for a couple minutes, and as I said, this is kind of just a primer, short mini episode to kind of get us back into the swing of things, but this is the one I wanted to talk about, the one that piqued my interest. Pythagoras taught a teaching called the Transmigration of the soul, which is kind of a pretty way of talking about reincarnation. He believed that after death, souls migrated from their present body to another body. If you were human, then maybe to another human body, or maybe into an animal body. And if you're an animal, vice versa, maybe into a human body. But Pythagoras nonetheless believed that the soul survived death. This was interesting at a time where most Greek and Western thought, really believed in this concept of Hades or Sheol, the grave. So most people actually would go to this place of just, shadow and darkness. And you had like this idea of the Elysium Fields, which would come a little bit later, which was sort of like this idea of heaven or a paradise type place, Elysium. But for the most part, Greek thought was very bleak when it came to this idea of the afterlife, and the idea that you would be born again into this world and kind of incarnate again on this plane was not at all a native idea to Greek and Western thought. This is why I'll circle back and say that I thought it was interesting he was educated in Egypt, because what we do know is that the idea of reincarnation traces its earliest roots to the Middle East. I know today we kind of associate it with Hinduism, Buddhism maybe, but definitely Eastern thought nonetheless. And that is because those ideas really took hold there and blossomed in that part of the world. But I don't think they originated there. Most evidence would suggest that the earliest teachings around reincarnation actually took place a few thousand years ago in the Middle East, and the Egyptians were early proponents of it. And I know that might sound interesting because the Egyptians later on would convert to believe in the idea of, their own afterlife, and they didn't believe in reincarnation on a normal, everyday man kind of basis. So it's weird how those ideas shift, but at the time when Pythagoras was being educated, I'm sure he was being exposed to these ideas in the libraries and in the schools in Egypt, probably coming from teachers and scholars, from the Middle East and from the Far East. So it's interesting how these things, even at that time, made their way across land and across sea and kind of took root in new minds. And Pythagoras would kind of be the forefather of taking this idea of the rebirth of the soul and bringing it to a Western audience. So in any case, like I said, he believed that after death, our bodies would reincarnate. The interesting thing about Pythagoras' belief was that it didn't necessarily depend on your works or your actions in this life. It wasn't about, karma or karmic justice, or, if you lived a terrible life, you'd come back as a dung beetle or a worm. It wasn't like that. He believed that there may be some freedom of choice in terms of what you come back as, or it may just be by happenstance. We don't know. But he didn't really equate it to any sort of religious system. He just believed that you did come back. And the reason was he actually claimed to have recollection of past lives. So again, we're getting into second and third hand sources here, so take it with a grain of salt, but it has survived the test of time. And we do know that Pythagoras had followers who, pushed these teachings for hundreds and hundreds of years after his death. So stands to reason that he did, proselytize these things, but he claimed to have memories of past lives, and he believed that he was on this sequential journey where, and this was where it starts to sound more Eastern and maybe a little bit more religious in thought, he did believe that you could escape this cycle of rebirth and ultimately attain freedom. So again, it kind of sounds very Eastern, but he would have been exposed to it in Egypt, and it would have originated in the Middle East. Pythagoras believed that if you lived enough sequential lives, you could kind of build up enough experience and enough, I'd say, accrued wisdom to escape the cycle of rebirth and attain freedom. Now, when I say freedom, it doesn't necessarily mean this concept when you think of reincarnation, of attaining nirvana, but it was something similar. He did believe you could break that cycle of rebirth and become something more than human, kind of being reintegrated into the one, but not necessarily using those terms, or what we would consider, modern Eastern terms about nirvana and, a single union of one being. But his ideas would go on to influence Plato and Platonic thought, which is interesting, right? Because we think of Plato and, his idea of the realm of the forms. Well, a lot of that was influenced by Pythagoras and this idea of something higher, something bigger than this individual life that we live, and kind of aspiring to grow into that, kind of learn from life's sequential journeys and ultimately make it into this idea of a place where everything has its ultimate perfect form. I won't go too far into philosophy 101 here, but if you're familiar with Plato and his philosophy, Plato was big on this idea that there was a realm of forms where everything in its pure and true form existed outside of this worldly plane. It's kind of what Pythagoras believed, but he believed that you had to live multiple cycles in this world. And after a period of time and struggle and wisdom experience, you would kind of break free into this better, more perfect realm. And the idea of, it's thought that Plato's realm of the forms, which doesn't sound too unlike what we might consider this idea of a paradise or a perfect eternal state. I wouldn't go so far as saying heaven, but a place of perfection. That was all influenced by Pythagoras, who was in turn influenced by ancient thought, which would have come from Egypt, and then from there it could be traced back to, earlier civilizations in Mesopotamia. What I wanted to hone in on, though, just for the last couple of minutes here as we talk about Pythagoras and kind of just send you on your journey if you're interested in this subject to study it farther, is around this idea of the transmigration of the soul. Because we're taught in the West, especially in a Judeo-Christian culture, to just disregard anything that has to do with reincarnation, because we equate it with New Age teaching. It's a very New Age modern belief, we think, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. And just to preface, I'm not necessarily somebody who believes in reincarnation. I'm somebody who's intrigued by it. I think that there's some interesting and compelling cases I've heard, but I haven't heard enough to really make me a believer in it. But I am interested in it. And the part that interests me is I think that we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater when we look at Christian teaching, for example, in the words of Jesus, and we just say, oh, well, it's appointed unto man to die once and then face judgment. Like some of the Paul type epistles teaching that, seemingly that this idea is off the table. But if you recall in the Gospels, Jesus talked about things that sounded eerily like reincarnation. He talked about John the Baptist coming back in the form of Elijah. And when his disciples asked, if John was Elijah, he said he is, if you're willing to accept it. He didn't say he was like Elijah. He was a form of Elijah. He was a representation of Elijah. He said he is Elijah if you're willing to accept it. To me, that sounds a lot like what Pythagoras taught. This idea that somebody can come back and live another incarnation on this life. John the Baptist says that, no man born of women would be greater than John in the kingdom of heaven. Well, if John was the reincarnation of this Elijah character, that would make sense. And it's things like that that make me think maybe we're missing a piece of understanding when it comes to this idea of reincarnation and this idea of the soul kind of revisiting this plane. What piqued my interest in it was, with the expense of sounding like a cliche here, psychedelics. So first time, experimenting with a mind-altering substance, I had an experience where I felt like I had been here before. Again, I don't necessarily believe in reincarnation. It's not a teaching I espouse or tell other people that, they should look further into it. Honestly, I don't have a dog in that fight. I'm interested in it. But what I do know is that the one time I really expanded my mind, one of the first times I did it and really went under, I felt like I had been here before. And I can't really explain it. It wasn't just a deja vu thing. It felt like I had been here maybe multiple times, and that I had experienced what I was experiencing in that moment. It's like I tapped into something beneath the surface, something deeper into the core of my essence. You can call it the soul, the spirit, whatever. I felt like I was tapping into it, and it was reminding me that we had done this before. And, take it for what it's worth, but, Pythagoras, had these beliefs. Psychedelics existed in the ancient world. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that there is a deep memory, a memory of maybe you call it soul memory, that you tap into with the help of, certain inhibitors being taken away. And I had that experience. I'll leave it at that. And it really sent me down on this journey of saying, well, has anybody else, written about this, thought about this? I looked at, Hindu thought and Eastern thought around reincarnation, and that didn't really match up with what I was experiencing or what I felt, at least not completely. But when I found Pythagoras and this idea of the transmigration of the soul, I don't know, maybe just because the nuance to that system and that thought process, but it resonated with me a little bit more. And, I don't have any conclusive answers on it. Again, I just wanted this to be a little bit of a primer as we try to get back in the swing of things here. And I want you to just think about it with an open mind. If you're somebody that comes from a Christian background where, the idea of reincarnation just sounds like taboo and New Age wishful thinking, I would say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think this is a much, much older concept than what you're led to believe, and it's not that black and white. This idea of karmic justice doesn't necessarily tie into the earliest teachings around this idea of the transmigration of the soul. And I think, assuming Jesus was saying what I believe he was saying when he was talking about John, I think he was actually referring to a physical reincarnation of the person, the man, Elijah. So that spirit that lived in Elijah, that soul, would be the same one that lived in John the Baptist. I do think that's accurate to say that that's what Jesus was saying. Whether or not that's true in the sense that it's a reincarnation type event, well, I'll leave it for you to decide. Maybe you have your own way of interpreting it. But to me, it sounds like, if I'm not trying to twist that to say something based on my belief system and preconceived ideas, it sounds to me like Jesus was talking about reincarnation of the soul, and that John was in fact a reincarnated person. So we have modern stories. There was a popular one in the media a few years ago. I think they did a special on 2020 or Dateline. Annie Jacobs, I think, wrote a book about reincarnation. I think it was Annie Jacobson. I could be wrong. So don't quote me on that. But somebody wrote a book that I read a few years ago, a female journalist, from a completely non-religious, non-woo-woo point of view, where she said, there's well-documented accounts, and she came with evidence in the book and sources. But one of them was a boy who claimed to have been shot down in World War II. He was a pilot. And, as a kid, he remembered the plane crash he died in. He remembered a fiery crash into the ocean. He recollected places, names. He could identify people in pictures. I mean, it was compelling stuff. I mean, it almost, made me a believer without even doing much research, because it seemed like this kid knew things. And I should have came prepared with the name, but I wasn't planning on talking about this, so I apologize. But if I find it, I'll put it in the show notes. But this kid's name, I forget it now, but he gradually started to lose those memories as he got older. But the beauty of it was, it's all on video. Like, there's recordings of him naming places and people and locations and identifying relatives who were people he knew in other lives who were since, much older. But this kid lived, I think he was a young kid in the early 90s. But he claimed to have died in a plane crash in World War II in the 1940s. So just really interesting. There's a lot of stories like that. There's a well-documented account of a young girl in India. I forget her name as well, so I apologize for that. I usually come prepared with sources for those of you who are new listeners, but like I said, we're just kind of getting back into the saddle here. I forget her name, but she recalled places, people, relatives, I think even family members from a past life, like close family members like children and a spouse. So really interesting stuff. Again, can some of those things be manipulated? In the age of the internet, can people make stuff like that up? Of course, no doubt. But there are some stories that are really hard to explain away, just like any of the phenomena, whether you're talking about ghosts or UFOs. I'd say 90% of what's out there is bunk, but that other 10% is really, really compelling and really hard to engage with and just dismiss. So that's the 10% that we like to look into in this podcast. So I hope this overview, really quick, really fast overview on Pythagoras, piques your interest, and then you'll go look into him a little bit farther, whether you're interested in the idea of numerology or the transmigration of the soul, his idea of music and numbers being associated with everything in the cosmos is really fascinating. But I think the transmigration of the soul teaching is the most overlooked teaching of Pythagoras, that it's kind of a shame. I think that it should be brought more to the forefront, that we should know him more for more than just his mathematical contributions, but also for his contributions to the concept of spirit and soul and the nature of reality. So that's Pythagoras. Now for a couple minutes, I just want to transition over to current events. Back in the winter, when the COVID lockdowns hit and caught everybody off guard, I don't think we knew what 2020 was going to be. And I remember at the very beginning of the year, the first podcast I recorded in 2020 was right after the death of Soleimani, leader of covert intelligence for Iran. He died in a drone strike. And I said, I remember saying something to the effect of, this could set the tone for the year. But I was saying that in the context of thinking, we're going to have a war with Iran, and by default, that's going to probably bring in allies, and you might have a new axis of, China, Iran, and Russia fighting against the West. And I thought, honestly, it could be kind of that type of a precipice moment. But the response from Iran turned out to be mild, and, the military war drums kind of subsided. But then lo and behold, right after that, you get this pandemic and the whole world goes crazy, loses its mind. And I don't want to talk about the politics of it. Are masks good, not? Is the virus dangerous? Is the death rate really what they say it is? Is it worth shutting down economies? I have some really strong opinions on that. I know some other people who have opposite opinions on it. It doesn't really matter what my opinion is or what anybody else's opinion is. What matters is that we're living in this new reality now, and it's been tough to navigate for all of us. Things have really died down in the last couple of months, not just in regards to the virus, which was already relatively mild effect on people who weren't immunocompromised, but just in regards to just normalcy. I think summer kind of let everybody kind of feel like things might be bouncing back to normal. Restaurants and stores starting to open back up again, at least where I live and in most of the country. And, with the inconvenience of having a mask on your face at all times aside, life had really started to feel like, okay, we're coming out the other side of this thing. But now in the last month or so, you see, case counts starting to trickle up again, people talking about regional lockdowns. Europe's going out of its mind, talking about doing a full-fledged shutdown again, which will kill the economy, by the way, in Europe if that does happen. We haven't had a stimulus bill here since the spring. Unemployment is at the highest levels we've seen it in since the Great Depression. It's just a crazy time right now. On top of that, you have all the personal stuff going on, people being cooped up at home. You can imagine domestic violence, divorce, substance abuse, depression, suicide. All those things are just shooting off the charts to highs. I haven't been immune to it myself. The last couple months I've been through the ringer, and I know I'm not alone in that. So many of you are in a similar situation, which is why I recorded a podcast about it, just trying to be vulnerable and put myself out there so that others would feel comfortable and feel encouraged knowing they're not alone. So all those things that came to a head. And the reason why I bring it up again now is because I said back in the beginning of summer, just to prepare, use the lull of summer to prepare. Get your house in order. If you have debts to pay off your debts. If you don't have food supply stored up, at least for a month's supply of food to feed your family, make sure you have it. If you don't have ways to protect yourself, guns, knives, home security, whatever, you need to have those things. You need to have a get out plan, a place where you can go if things get really hairy. I'm not saying, again, I did say this last time, I'm not saying that this is a sure thing, that things are going to completely melt down. I don't want to be like a prophet of doom type person. There's so many of those people out right now, and some of them drive me nuts. I'm just saying it's better to be prepared than to be sorry. And it does seem like it's probably, I would say at least like a 40% chance, which is extremely high, historically speaking, that things could get really bad this winter. And I don't just mean with the virus and death counts. I mean with the ramifications of the virus on top of an election year. I have never seen a presidential election as contested as this one is going to be. And when I say contested, I mean people are already talking about not recognizing the outcome, saying that there's fraud on both sides. You have avid Trump supporters who are out there already saying, there's going to be a revolution if Trump loses. I don't know if that's true. I mean, who knows? People talk. But I can tell you what I see in the world around me and the people around me is a lot of people who are really fed up. To make matters worse, a lot of people are really desperate right now. Like I said, the unemployment rate, people have lost jobs, people are underemployed, people don't know where they're going to go to supply, the things they need for their kids to maintain their lifestyles. And when people get desperate, they do desperate things. And all you need is something to spark a massive flame. You remember the George Floyd killing back in earlier this year. It was like a tinderbox. Everybody was locked down at home, miserable, losing their jobs. George Floyd dies. That video goes viral. The cities erupt. We're coming into an election that I think could have that same effect, but on a much larger scale. Worst case scenario is this. Regardless of who you want to win, most of you know how I feel about our political system in general. I'm kind of an alien in that regard, neither a Republican or a Democrat. Pox on both their houses, if you ask me. But I will say this. The worst possible scenario would be for Donald Trump to be clearly winning on election night, like way ahead in the polls. And then as the mail-in ballots start to trickle in, you see it shift over the next days and weeks to the point where they declare it in Biden's favor. Because if it looks like it's in Trump's hands and they have to take it out of his hands and give it to Biden, that's not going to go quietly into the night. There will be civil unrest, I promise you. That is the worst case scenario. So no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, you should be praying for a clear, decisive, just boot stomping victory on election night. If you want Trump to win, you better hope that he's up by like 100 electoral votes on election night and there's no chance of Biden coming back. If you want Biden to win, you better hope that he's already up quite significantly on election night and that the mail-in ballot only confirms that. Because if it is anything resembling a close election, which I think it will be, we're in for some tumultuous times. Gun sales always kind of pick up right before an election. People think a Democrat's going to get in office and, take all their guns away. But this is different. I think people are truly buying guns this time, not because they think that the guns are going to become illegal, but because they think they're going to need to use them. I was looking for a particular model of an AR-15 in my local gun shop, and they're back ordered until like next spring. I can't get that gun. And it's not just that gun. It's most guns. Like everything that's on the shelves right now is junk for the most part because people are loading up. They're buying ammo too. I don't think, and I have said this in a recent episode, I don't think we're going to have another American style civil war in this country, but I do think we could very well have a French Revolution style war in this country, where just mob mentality takes over, and certain groups, whether it be liberal elites or just technocrats, whatever, ends up losing their head on a guillotine. I could see that happening for sure in the climate we're living in right now. I don't think we have enough structure to our division in terms of like equal weighting and ideology among liberals and conservatives to actually lead to a civil war. Honestly, I think if we had an American-style civil war, it'd be the shortest war in history, because the conservatives have all the guns and the liberals would be overrun. They would just stop supplying farm food to the cities, and they would just hold them under martial law, and that would be that. The cities would have to surrender. I hate to admit it for all my liberal friends out there, but you guys would be completely decimated in a civil war. I grew up on a farm. I know a lot of those farm boys, and the people who are at those Trump rallies have a lot of firepower, and they're also the ones who are the makers and producers. They're producing food. The liberals, on the other hand, are producing intellectual information, intellectual content, white collar type work, and that's not going to get you very far when it comes to blows. So if we had that type of war, it would be over very quickly and very one-sided, and it would probably result in a fascist state. So let's hope that doesn't happen. What I do think is much more likely to happen, and a very real possibility for the first time in my adult life anyway, I could say I really feel like this is a real possibility. I think that there could be a class-based uprising where, as the discrepancy now due to COVID and the unemployment crisis really shows the separation between the haves and the have-nots, I think the have-nots are going to demand retribution, and that's going to come in the form of blood, especially if this election goes sideways. So take it or leave it. I'm giving you this advice because I want you to be prepared. I want you to make sure you have the means to protect yourself and protect your family. Have a plan, a safe place to go, especially if you live in a city. If you live in a country, in the country or in a rural setting, this doesn't really apply to you. But if you live in a major metropolitan area, have a means to get out. I mean, don't let what happened in the spring happen to you this time around, because it'll be worse. All the people that got stuck in New York City, got stuck in LA, all these people who were just trapped and couldn't get out. You don't want that to happen. Trust me, that is a nightmare, especially when civil unrest kicks off. So if you're in an urban area, have a get out plan. Even if, just as a precautionary measure, you could say I'm crazy, but I would say like on election night or a couple days after, just leave the city, go out into the country. If you've got family out there, get a hotel. Better safe than sorry. I mean, if there's civil unrest and people start shooting bullets at each other, who knows what happens after that? The military gets sent in, martial law kicks off. I mean, from there, it's anyone's guess. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that the number of registered militias and the number of gun owners in this country is going up significantly, seemingly by the month. And I don't think that's for nothing. I think there's a really good chance, especially if Trump loses, that things go sideways in terms of civil unrest. And if it's a contested election, head for the hills for a little while. That's my advice. So I won't say much more than that. I'll start sounding like just repeating myself here. I don't want to keep beating the same drum, but I do want you to understand the weight of this. I think there is a chance between the combination of COVID, a lack of economic stimulus, and more layoffs coming in the fall, and then a contested election. It could really be a trifecta of just yuck. It could be a bad year going into early 2021. So just keep your guard up, be smart, and be careful. All right, now I want to jump into the final segment of this podcast. So this is a 3 for today. Saving this one for last because I know this is probably the one people want to hear about least, but I just wanted to give you guys a quick update. I'm going to try to keep this brief. I was an emotional wreck when I recorded the last podcast, and I hope you can hear in my voice that I'm in a better state of mind now. I've had 2.5 months of just true, deep reflection and doing work on myself. I'm not going to get too personal here. For those of you who I do know personally, I'll talk to you over email, things like that, over the phone. But, I had a really come to Jesus moment and I say that in quotes, in my life a couple months ago, where my whole world just seemed like it was just caving in on itself, and not for lack of contribution on my part to cause it. And I really just had a soul-searching few weeks. I actually drove around the country for a couple of weeks. I stayed with family, brothers who live in 2 different parts of the country, and then just drove around, spent a lot of time on my own, staying in hotel rooms, I'll tell you what, if you ever really want to know what you're made of or get to know yourself on a deep level, spend a night alone in a stale hotel room while you're going through an existential crisis, and you'll work some things out. Trust me. In short, I'll knock on wood when I say this, I'm doing a lot better. Things are on the upswing. I really have been doing a lot of work on myself, on the relationships in my life, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, trying to just be a better man, and just really, truly look at myself and try to just be humbled. Take that humbling pie. I don't ever want to say of myself, I am humble. I think that by default, if you call yourself humble, you're probably not. But I meant being humbled. I felt like I was humbled externally, against my will. And you know what? It was exactly what I needed. I still need it. God knows I need it. So I'm growing. I'm learning new things every day. I think I said in that podcast, I'm coming back home. And what I meant by that is, I'm coming back to, the faith and the foundation of simplicity that I was accustomed to for a long time. I don't want to say a specific ideology in terms of like the conservative Christianity that I was raised on. I do consider myself a Christian, a follower of Jesus. A pretty crappy one for most of my years, but somebody who nonetheless has tried and continues to try to do that. I have no shame in admitting that. I do believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. However, I have serious problems and issues, most of you know, with a lot of the religiosity and doctrine that has risen up around that over the last 2,000 years. And I do not consider myself a Christian in the sense of the modern notion of that word, like somebody who is tied to a bunch of ideological ideas and, pet moral ideas like that I think were tacked on later. Like a lot of those things I just don't believe. But the core of the gospel, yes, I am a Christian in that regard. I've never been ashamed to admit that. But I am kind of ashamed to associate myself with Christianity. So I just want to be clear on that, because most people that I know who consider themselves Christian, I'm not saying they're not great people. Many of them are awesome people, but I don't think our belief systems are the same. So I'll just leave it at that. At the core, I think we have the same core, faith, but a lot of the tangible stuff attached to it is different. So what I'm coming back to is just that reliance on God to steer my life, and not for me to be the master of my own ship, which I've kind of prided myself on trying to be. And I drove it into the rocks, man. So pray for me. Keep me in your thoughts and prayers. I am not out of the woods by any means. My family will tell you, though, that they're seeing positive changes in my life, and hopefully, in all of our lives as a family unit. And I'm trying to grow, like I said, as a man, as a friend, somebody to confide in, and somebody to lean on. So I want to be that for the people in my life. And I hope, those of you listening, that you are that for those around you. But I haven't always been. So I just had a real candid heart-to-heart with my listeners in that last episode, just letting you know, that I was trying to turn the corner and turn the page and start a new chapter in my life. And I was hoping that would motivate and give courage to those who are in a dark place right now, which so many of us are. I'd hope it'd give them courage to do the same. So that was why I got really personal in that last episode. I know some of you have been concerned, asking if I was done with the podcast, asking if I was going to come back. Honestly, I've been wanting to record for like a month and a half now. I have to be in a certain state of mind to record a podcast. And as you can probably tell by how choppy this one is, I'm still not fully in it, but I'm trying to kind of force myself. I just haven't been there, and I really need the time to just work on myself, and I'm still doing that, and I'll be doing that for the rest of my days. Whether God gives me 1 or 1 million, I'm gonna be working on myself. But I have no intentions of ceasing from the podcast. I just needed a break, and that may happen again. I'm not going to promise you that there won't be another interval where I need to just step away and kind of reset. I don't want those old habits and old demons to come back up. Number one being my own pride and my own arrogance, which is, it's ugly when it rears its head, and there's no reason for it. It's just always been there. I don't have any like crazy exceptional skills or talents or accomplishment, but like many men, there's this ego and this thing, this shadow, like Carl Jung would call it, that lives within us. And mine, for whatever reason, is always been pretty greedy. So If I feel like it's getting the best of me, I may step away just from any sort of public activity for a while until I feel like I have a hold on it again. But that's what's going on in my life. There's been a lot of pain, a lot of learning, a lot of hard truths I didn't want to know, that I've had to learn, many about myself. But you know what? I've been able to grow from them, and I'm continuing to grow from them. So that's what life is. Like I was saying about Pythagoras earlier, maybe we learn and we grow in these incarnations, like he said, and then eventually we attain that freedom. And for me, that freedom is oneness with Christ, and I hope that I do live up to that and attain that one day. But that's not where I am now. But I'm not where I was a couple months ago. And, by God's grace, I hope I can say I'm even farther along and in a better place a month from now. So those of you who are prayers, pray for me, keep me in your thoughts and prayers. I will do the same for you. And I want to thank you for sticking with me. Many of you reached out and just said, hey, I'm thinking of you. It sounds like you're going through a hard time. I want you to know we're here, et cetera, et cetera. None of that went overlooked. I know I didn't respond to every email, and I'm sorry. I usually try to make it a point to do that, but I hope you can understand. Just given the circumstances, I haven't really been in a place to do that. But rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated. I will be back, hopefully for the better, and hopefully the content on this podcast will be better and continue to give you, things to be interested in and things to look into further on your own. I know this was a little bit all over the place and maybe a little bit forced, but I needed to just get something out there. Otherwise, I was probably going to sit around and ponder it for another 2 months, and I didn't want to do that. So even if it sucks, it's something, and I'll be back, I promise, as soon as possible with things that are more accustomed to this podcast. And I'll stop whining and talking about myself. I promise that as well. All right, guys, take care. Be safe, be happy, be healthy. Which applies now more than ever, but also be prepared. I should start saying that more often in this podcast, especially at the end. Just be prepared, come whatever may. You don't need to be a prepper. You don't need to be doom and gloom. But somewhere along the way, this idea of being prepared became associated with being, hysterical or being a conspiracy theorist. And that doesn't need to be true. You don't have to be any of those things to just be prepared for the worst. That's just wisdom. So make sure your storehouses are full of grain, figuratively speaking, and save up for those times of lack, because we've, if I'm using like a biblical analogy here, like Joseph in Egypt, there were 7 years of plenty and 7 years that were lean, and we've been living in a metaphorical 7 years of plenty. I think it's been a lot more than 7, and we could be coming into a time of lack. So just be prepared. You can't go on living on the high horse forever in your personal life or as a society, and I've learned both of those things this year. So just be ready, come whatever may. Take care, everybody. I love you all. I'll talk to you soon.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.